Archaic Records.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Archaic Records here with you again. My name is Jamie, coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee. And for today's episode, we're going to go back and rank the studio albums by one of the most important artists in my musical autobiography, the human gateway drug that is known as Billy Idol. Billy Idol was born on November 30th, 1955, and as far as my personal fandom is concerned, I believe it dates back to 1994. Now, before I became a Billy Idol fan, I of course always sort of remember knowing who he was from a young age, based on my obsession with MTV as a young kid, but it really wasn't until the fall of 1994 that I began to discover his music for myself. It was not long after I began taking college courses, and there were a couple of guys in one of my classes that I had become sort of acquaintances with. We weren't necessarily the closest chums of all time, but to be perfectly honest with you, I didn't really have many friends back in those days, and you know what they say about beggars, right? Well, one day we were driving around in one of these guys' cars, and I was sitting in the back seat next to the CD book, and I had been assigned the task of picking out which was going to be the next album that we were going to be listening to as we were cruising around the town in which we lived. And I remember thumbing through my friend's CD book and stumbling upon an album by the name of Rebel Yell by this artist named Billy Idol, somebody that I knew primarily only by name. Now, I had obviously heard a few of Billy Idol's bigger songs on MTV and the radio, but generally speaking, when it came to the bulk of his catalog, I was sort of largely in the dark, and I remember sort of thinking it was funny for some reason that this guy even had a Billy Idol CD. Now, keep in mind, this is 1994, and I'm only 18 years old, and, you know, Rebel Yell only came out in 1983, so in 1994, it was only 11 years old, but there was something about it that I thought was comical. Maybe it was based on my youth, but to me, at that point in time, any album that was 11 years old was basically like geriatric, but there was still something about it that piqued my curiosity, and I remember pulling it out of the CD book and offering it up as my next selection. And I remember the guy, and I don't remember his name. Now, these two guys that I was acquaintances with, I was not friends with them for very long, and I don't remember either of their names. I'm not saying that to be a dick or anything. It just happens to be the truth. But I remember that he got very excited. He's like, "Oh yeah, I love Billy Idol." He's like, "Do you like this CD?" And I remember confessing that, like, man, I really don't know. I remember hearing a couple of these songs on the radio, but I really don't know. And so he excitedly grabbed it, he put it in, he cranked it up, and we drove around town listening to Rebel Yell by Billy Idol. And there's just something about that moment that just seemed like a perfect coming of age moment as far as I was concerned, because there was just something about that music that hit me in a way that a lot of music never had. I don't know if it was, you know, just that particular day, or if it was that particular, you know, setting, or what it was, but that album just hit me in a way that I thought it was pretty much the greatest music that I had ever heard in my entire life. And later that very same day, these two guys dropped me off at home, and I was feeling so wired over having listened to Rebel Yell that I immediately skedaddled it down to one of my local record stores, where I picked up 3 different Billy Idol CDs in one stop. I picked up the Rebel Yell CD, I picked up Whiplash Smile, and I picked up the 1982 Billy Idol solo debut. And I remember back in those days, of course, you know, going to the record store was, and still is for me, but it was just a part of daily life when it came to purchasing music. But one of the things that you sort of learned to dread back in those days was the sort of snotty record store clerks, which ironically is something that I'm sort of nostalgic about today. Now, I still go to the record store on very heavy rotation, but it's a lot different nowadays because the record collecting public now is such a niche market and it's such a community that when you go into the record stores now, all of the people that work in the record stores are really quite lovely. They get to know you after a while and they kind of know your musical proclivities and you have conversations about it. But back in the 1990s, the people that worked in record stores were not always the most pleasant people to have an interaction with. And I remember probably even knowing how uncool I was being by buying 3 Billy Idol CDs at once, but I was so wired and I was so focused on what I was doing that I actually really didn't even care. So I remember I ran up there and I threw these Billy Idol CDs on the counter and I had to interact with one of these particularly snitty record store clerks. And I remember specifically that he kind of looked down at what I was purchasing and he looked back up at me and he's like, you must be some sort of super fan, huh? And I remember looking at him. I was like, really? Really? You want to be a smartass? Why don't we take this outside and we discuss it with our fists? Or perhaps you'd like to just bag this stuff up so I can get on my way, son. But then out loud, what I said was, yeah, I guess so. Thank you, sir. Thank you. And I took the CDs home and I listened to them. I immediately became just a massive fan. Over the course of the next couple weeks, I went out and I picked up the loose odds and ends of Billy Idol's solo catalog that I had as of yet not collected. And at a certain point in time, I felt as if my Billy Idol collection was relatively complete. Now, that's not counting, obscure singles and compilations, but as far as the studio albums went, all of my ducks were in a row, as the children like to say. But one day I was in one of my record stores downtown, and because I was still in this sort of Billy Idol zone, I went and I decided to dig through the Billy Idol CDs, despite the fact that I was confident that I pretty much owned everything that I needed to own, until I encountered a CD that, and I don't say this lightly, that literally changed my life. And that is this CD right here. As I was digging through the Billy Idol CDs, I couldn't help but discover this CD called Generation X Perfect Hits 1975 to 1981. I thought to myself, perfect hits? Well, that's sort of presumptuous, isn't it? But I also remember thinking that this CD must have been put back in the wrong place by either a distracted clerk or a lazy customer. But there was something about the cover that I still thought was interesting, so I picked it up. I turned it over, and I could not help but discover that the first track on this CD was Dancing With Myself, which, of course, I knew as, at the time, being a Billy Idol song because it was included on the copy of the 1982 Billy Idol debut album, which I owned. And if you look at this picture on the top right here, just over from the track listing, and you notice that young gentleman right there, with that lovely coiffed of bleach blonde hair, I couldn't help but notice that that was my relatively new friend, Bill. And just knowing that this album existed, I was immediately elated. Now, before I discovered this CD, I have to plead total ignorance. Now, this was pre-internet. This wasn't something where you could just Google somebody and look up Wikipedia and look up their track listing. I had no idea that Generation X 1 existed, and on the very off chance that I'd ever even heard of the band Generation X, I had no idea that there was an association to Billy Idol. So I immediately bought this CD, took it home, listened to it, and like I said, to say this album blew my mind would be a gross understatement. This is an album that completely changed my life. Not long after hearing this album, it took me probably a week, maybe 2 weeks, to go out and secure all 3 of the Generation X studio albums, and by that point in time, they were my favorite band in the world. And as an extension of that, I was completely obsessed with Billy Idol. For many years, Billy Idol was my dude. He was somebody that I defended at all cost. It was a hill that I was more than willing to die on, and I remained a insane super fan for many, many years of Billy Idol, and I still am a huge fan of Billy Idol. It's not that I'm not a fan. I'm just not a fan on the level that I was between the ages of probably 18 and 22, when I was just completely obsessed with Billy Idol. But one of the other important things that this particular CD, Perfect Hits, did for me was not only at the time turn me on to my favorite band, but this album was a gateway into me discovering that entire sort of first wave of punk rock, which to this day is still my favorite era of music, bar none. My favorite era of music, as I've said this before, is 1976 to 1984. And it was really this album and the discovery of Generation X through this album, and then my love of Generation X that sort of spread into me discovering a lot of these bands that I had only known really by name up to that point. Bands like the Ramones and the Sex Pistols and the Clash and the Jam and all of those bands from the first incarnation of punk rock, post-punk and new wave. So I can never, ever overstate how much this CD or Generation X or Billy Idol mean to me in any capacity. As far as this ranking is concerned, there are 10 albums on this ranking list. Now, you think back to Billy Idol, he's been making music for 50 years. There's really only 10 albums on this ranking. So over the course of 50 years, Billy Idol hasn't necessarily been pumping out studio albums on the ultra regular. But one thing that he continues to do throughout, at least the time that I've been a fan of his, is he's constantly out on the road. He's constantly touring. He's somebody that I've been very fortunate enough that I've seen Billy Idol live on countless occasions. And, the guy's starting to get up there in age a little bit now. He's pushing 70 years old. He's going to be 70 years old next November. Not this upcoming November, but next November. But if you go out and see him live, he still is one of the greatest live performers I've ever seen. I've never seen Billy Idol mail in a show. He is an absolute pro. He is somebody that can work an audience unlike most other people I've ever seen live. To see Billy Idol come out on stage, he can literally hold an audience in the palm of his hand, which is something that it really is quite inspiring to see live. And one other thing I'd like to recommend, if you haven't had an opportunity to see Billy Idol live, that's something that you absolutely have to do before he calls it a career. But another thing I'd like to recommend before we get into this ranking itself is Billy Idol's book, Dancing with Myself. Now, this is one of my favorite rock books of all time because Billy Idol is somebody that I am such a big fan of, and for 4 or 5 years of my life, he was my musical obsession. He was literally my god. I literally thought that Billy Idol walked on water, but this book is incredibly well written. It's really funny. It's written in Billy Idol's voice. Billy Idol has a certain way of talking to where you definitely know it's him, and there's certain ways he uses the language. There's sayings he's sort of, known for, and this book is one of my favorite music books of all time. It kind of reminds me in a way of going back and watching the Billy Idol Behind the Music, which was one of my favorite television shows back when it was actually still running, which was Behind the Music. And Billy Idol's Behind the Music is probably one of my favorite of all time because it's Billy Idol, who's one of my favorite artists of all time, but it's also so funny, and he's got such a good sense of humor about who he is, and he's very self-deprecating, and of course, because it is Billy Idol, you can imagine how much debauchery there is involved, which, to me, the thing with the rock books, as far as I'm concerned, is, yeah, I dig the debauchery, I'm all in on stuff like that, but for me, I prefer more the elements of the book that are more biographical, and especially once you get into the music and the actual creative process and what it's like to actually play in a band and the writing process and touring, and especially with somebody like Billy Idol, who rose to just such huge fame. His book is incredibly well written. It's really funny, but it's also very informative, and I don't think he spends too much time on the debaucherousness, which to me can get a little bit tired. So if you haven't seen Billy Idol live or read his book, Dance With Myself, I would highly recommend it. Anyway, like I said before, this ranking has 10 albums on it from both Generation X and Billy Idol's solo career. For me, this was both, easy and difficult. There were certain parts of this ranking list that were extremely easy, especially when it came to the bottom album on Billy Idol's ranking. To me, that is an album that has pretty much always been my least favorite, probably always will be my least favorite, but it was also very, very challenging when we got into the top three in particular. The top three really sort of gave me a headache because I felt as if the top three could really go in any order, but I sort of finally had to make the decision as to where they would go. And I'm still sort of second guessing it, to be perfectly honest with you, Stan. Anyway, let's get into this without any further ado. There are 10 albums on this ranking list, and as I've said this before, whenever I do these, these ranking lists of artists that I really love, I just always hate when there's one album that sort of has to be relegated as the worst or the end of the train. But in the case of Billy Idol, for me, it's easy. And this has always been my least favorite album, going back to the days when I was obsessed with Billy Idol. Back in those days, I would never say anything bad, really, about even a single song, but secretly there were albums that I listened to much less than some of the other ones in his catalog, and this is an album that today I never listened to, and even back in the mid-90s when I was obsessed with him, this is a record that I did not listen to very often. And it was funny, too, because when I first bought this record, it was one that I actually thought I would really like. It was one that I was actually anticipating being one of my favorites, and so I would make the suggestion that when I first bought it and I sat down and I actually listened to it for the first time, not just the big single that came off of this record, it was really disappointing. And it's still, every time I listen to this record, it's kind of a letdown. I've actually been listening to it over the past week or so, trying to get this ranking list together. And man, this is a tough one to get through as far as I'm concerned. But this record came out on April 30th, 1990. It was produced by Keith Forsey, and it is Charmed Life. Now, this is an album that was absolutely huge when it came out. Of course, that was basically triggered by the success of the album's first single. But I'll never understand why this album is as big as it is in terms of the music. Now, I always sort of contend that this album sort of benefited from its timing a little bit because this album was released in April of 1990, and this album was huge. And now, obviously, there was a video and a single that just catapulted this album up to, the stratosphere. But had this same exact album come out a year later in April of 1991, because between April of 1990 and April of 1991, the musical landscape had shifted dramatically. We are now in the post-Nevermind world. This album, same exact album, note for note, song for song, this same album that was huge in 1990 would have been laughed out of stores in 1991. This album may not have even gotten released in 1991. This album, to me, is just not very good. And even trying to go through and listen to it over the past week or two, even trying to pick a song out here or there that I like is a real challenge. Now, stylistically, this album is different because in between the record that came out before this one, which was Whiplash Smile, and this one, Charmed Life, Billy Idol and his guitarist Steve Stevens part ways. And I've always felt that, at least when it came to Billy Idol's solo career, that Steve Stevens is as vital to Billy Idol's sound as Billy Idol is himself. And for this album, Billy Idol recruits a guitar player by the name of Mark Younger Smith, who I'm sure in his own way is a talented enough guitar picker, but he absolutely has no style. This album is as bland and boring as anything I've ever heard. Now, famously, this album is the album that was finished on February 5th, 1990 in Los Angeles. Billy Idol went home after hearing the final mix and was so excited by this album that he decided to take his motorcycle back to the studio to pick up some tapes of it to bring back to his house to listen to again. In this transit in between his home and the studio, of course, Billy Idol suffers a famous motorcycle accident, which basically almost kills him and leaves him, disabled for the beginning of the release of this album. It cost him a role in the Doors film. Well, it didn't really cost him a role in the Doors film, but he ended up having to scale down his film in the Oliver Stone Doors film, and forced him to use a cane for a lot of what would turn out to be the Charmed Life tour. But this album, to me, it doesn't really do anything, and I really, really don't like the guitar work of Mark Younger Smith. For one thing, I've never been a fan of the whole vanilla blues thing, because I always feel as if vanilla blues is a very bland and generic style of music, and when it's done badly, it really is something that turns me off. And the guitar work on this record is just not good. The songwriting is not good. The first song on this album is called The Loveless, which is okay. Pumping on Steel is pretty rough. Prodigal Blues is good. There's a song called Trouble with the Sweet Stuff, it's just like an abortion. I mean, it's one of the worst songs Billy Idol ever did. Side 2 starts off with the biggest song on this album, which of course is Cradle of Love, which was the video and the single which catapulted this album into being one of Billy Idol's biggest selling albums of his career. But I would make the argument that if you're judging this album based on music and you're judging the song Cradle of Love based as a song, it just isn't that great. I mean, everybody, of course, is aware of the video for Cradle of Love, which features probably one of the best, now this was 1990, but it was one of the best 80s MTV vixens of all time, which was Betsy Lynn George. Billy Idol owes as much of the success of this album to her as it does to the music on this album, because the music on this album is just not very good. I was talking to somebody recently about this album, and I told him that it was my least favorite Billy Idol album, and it always is. And this person basically accused me of being an idiot because, as he put it, everybody loves Charmed Life. And I would make the argument that that doesn't necessarily prove your point. I mean, look around at what everybody loves. People like Post Malone and Taylor Swift. Your Honor, I rest my case. Love Unchained is not good. The Right Way is not very good. License to Thrill is embarrassing. The song Endless Sleep is okay. If I had to pick a favorite song off of Charmed Life, that is easy, and it would be the cover of L.A. Woman by The Doors, which is not It's not necessarily a home run, but it's easily the best song on this record. And actually, I really like the video, Billy Idol's video for LA Woman. I actually like that video much more than I like the video for Cradle of Love, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. So for me, number 10, that one's easy. That is Charmed Life from 1990. Number 9. This album came out on March 22nd, 2005, produced by Keith Forsey. This was Billy Idol's first album in 12 years when it was released, coming out of the sort of cyberpunk hibernation that, was created by the sort of dismal performance by Billy Idol's album coming out before this one. This album is called Devil's Playground. And I remember when this record was finally announced after 12 years in between albums. I was actually relatively excited when it was announced. Now, my Billy Idol fandom had been sort of reined in. By this point in time, I had put Billy Idol sort of in his proper perspective. I was still a huge fan, still am a huge fan, but he was not any longer my favorite artist of all time, and probably not even really in my top 10, 15, or 20 by this point in time. But I was relatively excited when this record was announced. It was something that I had seen him live several times right before this record was announced, and he was always great live. He had seemed as if he would be sort of began to put his career back on the tracks after it sort of got derailed by cyberpunk. And this album to me is okay. Now, it's a lot better than Charmed Life. Charmed Life to me is easily the last one. I mean, everything else from Charmed Life is a huge step up. This one, including, now this isn't necessarily one of his best albums. I would accuse this album of being a little bit sort of generic sounding. Now, he was smart in the sense that for this record, he brought Steve Stevens back into the fold, who, as I mentioned before, I feel as if is as important to Billy Idol's solo sound as Billy Idol is himself. And there's a lot of really great Steve Stevens guitar work on this record. There is a lot of good Billy Idol's sort of, rock and roll, straightforward songwriting, great vocal performances. But this record, after a while, when you sit down and you listen to the whole thing, start to finish, a lot of it sort of begins to kind of bleed together. This album doesn't have a ton of personality. Now, it's nowhere near as vacant as Charmed Life, which, again, I have to wash my hands after I touch Charmed Life, you understand. But this one's much better. But at this point in time, almost 20 years into this record's life, this is one that I don't really go back and listen to very often. I've been listening to it this week, trying to get into doing this ranking, and there is definitely some stuff on this album that I really like. I like the song Super Overdrive. That is a very, classic, straightforward Billy Idol rock song. It kind of reminds me of the song that he did for the Speed soundtrack. World Coming Down is awesome. World Coming Down is like a real, almost like a straight ahead sort of punk song. I like the song Sherry. I don't love the song Plastic Jesus. Scream was the first and definitely the big single off of this record. I remember when Scream first came out, and I remember if I heard the song first or if I saw the video first. I was like, all right, Billy Idol's back. This kind of sounds more like, Billy Idol. Of course, it had been 12 years since Cyberpunk had come out, but the song Scream, it reeked of attitude. It had his snarl. I thought it was good. I still think it's a good song, but there's a song on this record. The one that's directly after Scream, sort of ends side one, which might be one of the worst songs in Billy Idol's entire catalog, and that is the song Yelling at the Christmas Tree. Now, I gotta be honest with you, I've told you this before on this channel. I am not necessarily a big fan of Christmas music, and I get what he's doing with this song. It's supposed to be funny, it's supposed to be about a dysfunctional Christmas, and I sort of understand the point of it, and it's not without its charm, I suppose, but I just don't like it. And I gotta tell you that I don't even find it to be all that funny. I mean, I have a PhD in dysfunctional Christmases, Bill, and it isn't necessarily that funny. I remember the first time I heard this song, I had this very intense urge to invite Billy Idol out to lunch at this deli near where I was living at the time. Now, this deli was famous for serving up these world-famous knuckle sandwiches. And the first time I heard the song, I thought, that's what Billy Idol needs, because this song is just not good. Like I said, I'm not necessarily a big Christmas guy. Now, in 2006, Billy Idol would double down with the Christmas theme and release an entire Christmas album, which is not even on this ranking list because I can't do it. I've said this in the past on this channel. I can deal with Christmas music maybe 1 or 2 days a year, and that's it. And when I hear Christmas music, it's fine if it's, Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin and Nat King Cole and Sammy Davis Jr. That is fine, but I don't need to hear Billy Idol singing Silver Bells. That is not the height of snugness. And this song doesn't even fit on the rest of the record. I don't understand it. If there's one reason why this album is 9th out of 10, it's probably because of the song, Yelling at the Christmas Tree. If I never hear this song again, I will live the rest of my life as happily as possible. In fact, I'm going to make it a point after going through and re-ranking these albums that I never listen to that song again. If I do a deep dive episode on this album at some point in time on Archaic Records, I'm going to have to skip Yelling at the Christmas Tree. After that, there's a song called Romeo's Waiting, which I really like. Body Snatcher is good. The song Cherie is good. Man, if I had to pick a favorite song off Devil's Playground, that's tough because there's some good songs on this. I really like the song World Coming Down. I'll go with the last song, Summer Running, for me. Number 9 from 2005, Devil's Playground. This album it's about 50-50, if you're willing to look past the Christmas song. All right, number 8. This album was released on June 29th, 1993, produced by Robin Hancock, and this is an album that I did a full episode on a while back here on Archaic Records. It is an album that I actually kind of like. It was a record that I defended when it was out new, and it's a record that I still sort of defend to this day, and that, of course, is the notorious Cyberpunk. Now, as I mentioned before, in 1990, when Billy Idol released one of his most popular and my least favorite album, Charm Life, Billy Idol was really sitting on top of the world. I mean, Charm Life was one of the biggest albums he had ever made, but as I said before, I feel like part of the reason why that album was so successful was because it benefited from being released pre-grunge, whereas Cyberpunk, unfortunately for Billy Idol, was released post-grunge. And if you want to take a seminar on how to destroy your career in 70 minutes, you might want to go back and listen to the album Cyberpunk. Now, as I just said, I like Cyberpunk. I did an entire episode on this album in the past, and I actually really kind of like Cyberpunk. There are elements of this album that I still think are ahead of its time. And, you think of where music was in 1993. Again, this was the height of the grunge era. I said the same thing on the video I did a couple weeks ago where I was ranking the albums by the band U2, and I talked about their record Zooropa, which, coincidentally, this record was released just a week, I think, ahead of Zooropa. But, in 1993, you are at the height of the grunge revolution. So for Billy Idol to release basically a techno rock album although you, in hindsight, could sort of see that as being comical, I think it took enormous onions to sail his ship in the complete opposite direction of everything else that was going on in music, at least in the United States. And if you're Billy Idol, you don't really have the option of going grunge, right? I mean, nobody is going to listen to Billy Idol in a flannel shirt, crying about the emptiness of being. I mean, Billy Idol is not that type of artist. So for him to make a techno pop album actually probably makes a little bit more sense than it would to, put out a grunge album. But I mean, this album bombed. And I think, unless you are old enough to remember, or were paying attention, or were aware of how badly this album did, it's something that is quite remarkable. I mean, this was an album that completely destroyed Billy Idol's career for probably, a decade. And it was funny because I talked about this when I did the deep dive into Cyberpunk. I mean, the reviews of this record were just heinous. I mean, critics went after Billy Idol personally. There were lynch mobs roaming the streets looking for his house. I mean, this album unified the Israelis and the Palestinians. They're like, yeah, we don't like you and you don't like us, but you gotta admit, this album is a bag of shit, man. But it really isn't. This album is really not that bad. And actually, as it's approaching, well, it is. It just turned 30 years old. This album actually is about 50% really good. The songs on this album that work are awesome. The ones that don't work are somewhat forgettable. But I actually have a real soft spot in my heart for Cyberpunk. I mean, when I was in my Billy Idol obsessed phase back in 1994 to like 1998-ish, this was an album that I ended up defending more than any other album in Billy Idol's catalog. I probably talked more about this record to people who were either not fans or casual fans than any of the stuff that people celebrate, because people always wanted to know, what about Cyberpunk? You love Billy Idol, what about Cyberpunk? And I always defended this record. Back in those days, I would not admit that there was a single piece of clunkage on this record, which there is, in fairness. But there's a lot of good stuff on this record, too. I like the song Wasteland. I don't like, nor have I ever really liked the song Shock to the System, which was the first single, and it's just not a very good song. The few times, or the several times I've seen Billy Idol live over the years, if he plays a song off Cyberpunk still, it's always Shock to the System. I would like to see him play some other songs. I think one time I saw him play Adam in Chains, which was cool. That's a song off Cyberpunk that I love, but Shock to the System is just, it's really generic. It doesn't work. This album also features Mark Younger Smith on guitar, which is even a worse fit for him than Charm Life, because on one side of this record you've got all this sort of techno pop computer music going on, and then on the other side of it you've got this sort of bad wannabe vanilla blues guitar. It really is a bad mesh. I'm usually a guitar-driven music fan, but I actually think the songs with less guitar on this record work better. I don't like the guitar on Shock to the System. I've seen him play it with Steve Stevens, and at least Steve Stevens can pump a little bit of life into it, because Mark Younger Smith guitar playing, nothing against him personally. I'm sure he's a lovely guy, but man, his guitar playing is some of the most generic I've ever heard. Tomorrow People is okay. Adam in Chains is awesome. New Romancer is good. Power Junkie is good. Love Labor's On is good. And then there's a song called Heroin, which, Lou Reed is pretty sacred territory as far as a lot of us are concerned. And to do sort of a techno dance version of the song Heroin is, maybe, it's ballsy, I'll say that. But maybe it's a little bit too much. Now, this song, Billy Idol's version of Heroin, of course, it combines a song by the Velvet Underground with a song by Patti Smith. Now, I've never really been a Patti Smith fan, so I don't really care so much about that. But Velvet Underground, man, that is like sacred territory. And Heroin off of Cyberpunk, it might actually be one of the worst cover songs ever made. I mean, it's sort of borderline inexcusable on a record that, generally speaking, I'm sort of okay with. But the song Heroin is nasty. And he actually released a single for the song Heroin and a video. But he put out this maxi single for the song Heroin, just in case the blasphemy hadn't been penetrated into your forehead enough. He put out a single that had like 5 different remixes of his version of Heroin, which were all just pretty nasty. I'm not kidding. Shangri-La is good. Concrete Kingdom. I like the song When the Night Comes. If I had to pick a favorite song off this record, it's probably Adam in Chains. I love that song. I love the intro to that song. It's this sort of weird guided meditation into the song Adam in Chains, which is awesome. It's probably my favorite song off that record. Number 7. This record was released on October 17th, 2014, produced by Trevor Horn of Buggles fame. And that is the album Kings and Queens of the Underground. This record is actually really good most of the way through. This is a record that I think Billy Idol should have aimed to put out more after the 12-year hiatus between Devil's Playground and Cyberpunk. Although between Devil's Playground and this record, it had been 9 years since the record came out, and this is still in 2015. This is his 2014, so this record's 10 years old. This is his newest album to date. Supposedly, he has a new record which is supposed to be coming out next year, so I'm sort of excited about that. It's something I will review on this channel given the opportunity. But this record actually has a lot of really good stuff on it, where I made the argument before that I thought that Devil's Playground was a little bit generic and it all sort of bled together. This record has a very diverse sort of soundscape. I like a lot of the music on this record. It's very well written. It's much better performed, I think, as Billy Idol has gotten older, especially over the past few years. He's starting to put out some of the best music he's put out since the Generation X era, or even the early 80s. This is a record I really like. I saw this tour. Actually, I think I saw this tour a couple times. And it was awesome. Like I said, Billy Idol is always incredible live. To watch Billy Idol work a crowd is just, it's a piece of art. I mean, it's as much a piece of art as his music is. But I really like this song, or this record. I love the song Bitter Pill. Can't Break Me Down is awesome. Really, there isn't too much off of this record that I don't like. I like the song One Breath Away, Postcards from the Past. The title track, I don't love the title track. Ghost in My Guitar is okay. If I had to pick a favorite song off of this record, it would probably be Nothing to Fear. But this is a very solid record. So if you haven't listened to Kings and Queens of the Underground, I would definitely recommend it. Like I said, this was a record that kind of surprised me when it first came out, because my expectations were sort of low based on the Devil's Playground, which I thought was okay. But again, it had been like 9 years since Devil's Playground had come out, since that record had come out, or since when this record came out. So didn't really know what to expect, but it's a big step up from that record, at least as far as I'm concerned. So I like that one. Number 6. This record came out on July 16th, 1982. Produced by Keith Forsey, and that is Billy Idol's self-titled debut record. Of course, following the breakup of his band Generation X in the UK, Billy Idol moved to New York City in order to pursue a solo career, and teamed up with Keith Forsey, who had produced the final album by Generation X, and teamed up with guitarist Steve Stevens. And this record, to me, is 75% really, really good. Now, there are a couple songs on this record that I don't necessarily love, and I remember the first copy of this CD, or this record I had on CD, it did have a version of, the version I had of it had the song Dancing With Myself as the album's closer. This is the one that has the song Congo Man, which has always sort of been a curiosity to me as to what Congo Man is all about. It's just sort of a novelty track as far as I'm concerned, but this is a very respectable self-titled debut, solo debut by Billy Idol. I think he was a little bit lost coming over to New York from England after the breakup of Generation X, and I've always said this about Billy Idol, especially I just was talking about this with Steve Stevens, that he and Steve Stevens seem to be sort of musical soulmates, and in Billy Idol's career, he's had two, collaborators that have really meant a tremendous amount to him. Of course, back in the days of Generation X, that was Tony James, who I believe Generation X would not be Generation X without Tony James, and in his solo career, it would be Steve Stevens, and we talked about Charm Life and Cyberpunk and how those records don't feature Steve Stevens and how they just don't sound like Billy Idol records. I mean, to me, this was obviously the first Billy Idol record, but this was the record that established the Billy Idol sound, and it's not necessarily, the best of his solo material, but I think it is a very, very decent debut album. This thing has a lot of really good songs on it. I like the song Come On, Come On. White Wedding is a classic. I mean, White Wedding is one of those songs that I never get tired of. I've heard the song White Wedding a million times. I never get tired of it. Whereas Hot in the City is a song that I just don't like. I never really have liked. I remember the first time I ever heard Hot in the City. I've talked about this compilation in the past, but when I was a kid, my mom had a few tapes in her car, and one of the tapes that she had in her car was this compilation called Summer Fun, Volume 2, which, looking back on it, is sort of a curiosity as to why my mom would have this particular compilation in her car, because this was really not her style of music. I mean, this compilation had Tony Basil, OXO, Flock of Seagulls, Kool and the Gang, Rick Springfield, Marshall Crenshaw, Devo, a lot of bands that I'd never associated with my mom, but one of the songs that was featured on this compilation, she wore this thing out too. She listened to this thing all the time. I basically knew this cassette by heart in her car, but it had the song Hot in the City on it, and even as a little kid riding around her car, I did not like that song. I've never liked the song Hot in the City. The version of it that's on Vital Idol is a little bit better, but I just don't really like the song Hot in the City. Dead on Arrival is awesome. Nobody's Business is the Jugs. Side 2, though, which generally speaking, Side 2 is pretty strong, but their first song on Side 2 is a song called Love Calling, which I don't really understand. And this was a song that, even at the height of my Billy Idol obsessiveness, I realized that this song wasn't ultra snug, but I remember that my best friend Tim used to give me grief about the song Love Calling because the chorus is so sort of silly, where he says, if you want to rub-a-dub, if you want to rub-a-dub, dub love. And my friend Tim just thought it was the funniest song in the history of the world. And inside, I sort of agreed with him that it wasn't necessarily Billy Idol's finest effort. But I remember I used to get so annoyed that he would make fun of that song, despite the fact that it really isn't a very good song. Actually, another album that we're not going to talk about on this ranking, because it's a compilation album, is the album Vital Idol, which, generally speaking, I kind of like Vital Idol, but there's a remix of Love Calling on this one, too, and it's actually called the Rub-a-Dub Mix of a song that I would accuse of being pretty lackluster, at least in my opinion. After that are two songs that are amazing. Hole in the Wall and Shooting Stars. It's So Cruel is awesome. And then he closes out the album with the song Congo Man, which is just kind of a sort of a novelty, a minute-long song. I've never quite understood the purpose of it. Like I said, the first copy of this I owned on CD had Dancing With Myself as the 10th track, but this one is the original with Congo Man. I don't really get it. If I had to pick a favorite song off this album, it would be Shooting Stars. I love that song. I love White Wedding too, but Shooting Stars is easily my favorite song off that record. All right, number 5. This record was released on October 20th, 1986, produced by Keith Forsey. And that is the follow-up to Rebel Yell, called Whiplash Smile. This is an album that I really love, for the most part. There's maybe 1 or 2 tracks on this record to me that I would file into the clunkage category, but this is a record that I love. Now we are starting to get into the stuff of legends, son. And this was a record that I still listen to this record a lot. Not on ultra heavy rotation. I don't listen to this record as much as I would go back and listen to, anything by Generation X or Rebel Yell, but this is a record that I've always just really loved. I love the artwork. This is my favorite of Billy Idol's album covers. And for many years I thought that this was a record that would be a little bit higher. Actually, when I did this ranking, this was one that kind of surprised me. I actually thought that this record would be a little bit higher because this was a record that I just used to absolutely wear out. And I think it is a classic, but it just happens to fall a little bit lower than some of the stuff coming up in the catalog. But I love the song World's Forgotten Boy. I don't love, and I really never have loved, the song To Be a Lover, which I know was one of the big singles off of this record. The video, too, I found to be sort of irritating. I mean, you can tell that Billy Idol is on a fair amount of cocaine, I would make the argument, in that video. And it's the video where he's in the boxing ring, and I just never really liked that song, and I still don't. I love the song Soul Standing By. Sweet 16 is awesome. I love seeing Sweet 16 live to this day. Man for All Seasons is good. Don't Need a Gun is awesome. Don't Need a Gun is not only one of my favorite videos of Billy Idol's, but it's one of my favorite songs. And as a hit, and I realize that Don't Need a Gun is a hit, I feel as if it's one of his sort of like more underrated big songs. I love Don't Need a Gun. Beyond Belief is awesome. Fatal Charm is awesome. One Night, One Chance is great, but my favorite song off this record is Easy. It's probably my second favorite song in Billy Idol's solo catalog, which is All Summer Single. I love that song. I can listen to that song every single day. This is still a record that I listen to a fair amount, not as much as some of the other stuff by Generation X in particular, but I love Whiplash Smile. So that one's number 5. Number 4. This album was released on January 23rd, 1981, produced by Keith Forsey, and it is the final Generation X album, Kiss Me Deadly. Now, this is an album that I love. I mean, I'm just going to be perfectly honest with you. This is a record that I absolutely love, but not quite as much as the first 2 Generation X records. This is a record that has a bit of a different sound. Also, a little bit different sort of, approach to songwriting. The band had matured by this point in time. I think they were writing sort of more mature songs. They were writing songs that sounded a little bit more professional. They certainly weren't, generally speaking. Now, there's still some brattiness and some snottiness on this record, but definitely not as much as you would find on the first 2 records. And, to me, one of the things about this record that sets it apart from the other 2 Generation X records was that this was the one that was produced by Keith Forsey. So to me, and I love Keith Forsey, that's not a dig. I mean, I love the stuff he produced with Billy Idol in his solo career, but to me, this record has more of a Billy Idol sound to it than it does a Generation X sound. And also, this was the band as they were sort of in free fall. They were sort of going through a lot of turbulence. They were in the process of breaking up, and this record sort of sounds like a band in the process of breaking up. There isn't a lot of continuity in the players on this record. A lot of people sort of come in and contribute. So the songs, although there is a good diversity of sound on this record, they don't all sort of sound the same. They don't all sound like the same band. But this is a great record. This is still a record that I go back and listen to a lot. Everything by Generation X, I go back still and listen to a lot. Obviously, the song starts off with the album starts off with the song "Dancing with Myself," which, man, I love the song "Dancing with Myself," but I got to be honest with you, I've just heard it too many times. I mean, this is a song if I never heard again, I think it would be okay. And I love the song "Dancing with Myself," but I'm honestly kind of burnt out on "Dance with Myself." I love "Untouchables." Happy People is the Jugs. Triumph is awesome. Revenge. Stars Looking Down. What Do You Want? Poison and Oh Mother are pretty decent ways to close out the album. But if I had to pick a favorite song off this album, that is easy. And that is the song Heaven's Inside. I mean, that song is snug. So for me, from 1981, this is number 4, Kiss Me Deadly. Now, this is where it got tough. Because these top 3 records, really, you could sort of interchange them in a lot of different ways. So I eventually had to just sort of settle on what was basically my first instinct when it came to this. Because it got to the point to where I was overthinking it, and I kept switching things back and forth, and then I just gave up, and I said, no, we're going to go with your first gut instinct. So for me, number 3, and all of these records are the Jugs, these top 3. These are still all records that I listen to on exceedingly heavy rotation. So number 3, from January 26th, 1979, produced by Ian Hunter. That is Generation X's second album, Valley of the Dolls. I did do an entire episode on this record a couple months ago where I broke the album down in its entirety, and man, this is one of my favorite punk rock records of all time. And this record came out basically just a year after. Or not even really a year after, like 10 months after the first Generation X record came out. And just in that time, between the first Generation X record and this one, the band's songwriting had evolved tremendously. Their playing had evolved tremendously. This is an awesome, sleazy, greasy, bratty, snotty, almost not even a punk. I mean, it's a punk rock record, but it's just a slimy rock and roll record. This is a record that I still listen to all the time. Now, I think I said on that video when I talked about this album in its entirety, I might have said that this was my favorite Generation X album. But, I mean, it's right there. These top 3 albums in Billy Idol's catalog, it's so tough because all 3 of these records are the Jugs. I love this record. This is still a record that I listen to all the time. I've been listening to all these records this past week, trying to put them in some sort of an order, and I get in the zone with this record. I'll listen to this record 2 or 3 times at a go. I love the song Running with the Boss Sound, Night of the Cadillacs. I mean, every single song on this record. I mean, really, there isn't a bad song on this entire record, honestly. Love Like Fire. If I had to pick a favorite song off of this record, man, that is a tough one because pretty much every song of this record is the Jugs. I guess I'll go with English Dream. Oh, man. I don't know. Valley of the Dolls is the Jugs, in my opinion. So that one's number 3. I mean, if your third best album is Valley of the Dolls, I think you've got a little bit of talent, son. All right, number 2. This album was released on November 10th, 1983, produced by Keith Forsey. This is the first album that I ever really remember listening to in its entirety in one of my friend's car. It is Billy Idol's best solo album, Rebel Yell. I remember the first time I ever heard Billy Idol and sort of knowing who he was. I was a little kid sitting in the living room with my dad. Now, my dad is an artist. I think I've told you this story in the past. But my dad was sitting there, and he was working on something. And we were sitting in the living room, and I was planted in front of the MTV when the video for the song Rebel Yell came on. And I remember seeing Billy Idol. And this was a time when, back in those days, every single person on MTV had an appearance that was just over the top. The 1980s were very over the top. So you sort of got numb to it after a while. It just became second nature to see artists who were just, very visually based. And I remember seeing this video for the song Rebel Yell. And even in that climate where everybody had this sort of outrageous look, there was just something about Billy Idol that sort of made me aghast as a kid. And I remember specifically turning to my dad and asking him, like, what is this? And my dad's sitting there working on his art project, and him looking up sort of, half interested. My parents weren't exactly the MTV generation. And I'll never forget my dad said, he said, he's punk. That's punk. And I remember, based on the way that punk rock had sort of been depicted in the media and films and television back when I was a kid, it was always sort of portrayed in a negative light. The punk rock character was always the villain. They were always sort of a dunderhead. They were always up to no good. They were the person who was trying to cause the main character some sort of adversity. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't want any part of that guy. I'm a good kid over here. But that was my first impression of Billy Idol, was that he was scary. He was one of those sort of lowbrow punk rock people, and I should probably steer clear of him. But that being said, this is easily my favorite album in Billy Idol's solo catalog over the past year and a half, 2 years really. He's been out celebrating the 40th and 41st anniversary of this record. I love that back sleeve. I love that picture of Steve Stevens. If anything reeks 1983, 1984, it's that picture right there of Steve Stevens. I mean, every single song on this album is the jugs. You can go through the entire process or the entire set list if you want. There isn't a bad track on this entire record. I love the title track still to this day. Rebel Yell, still a song I never get tired of. I don't care how many times I hear it. Daytime Drama is awesome. Blue Highway is the jugs. Flesh for Fantasy, Crank Call, Do Not Stand in the Shadows. The Dead Next Door is easily one of the most underrated Billy Idol songs of all time, is The Dead Next Door. If I had to pick a weakest song on this record, it's not easy, because I don't really think there is one. But if I had to pick a weakest song off Rebel Yell, it would probably be Catch My Fall, just because it does have this sort of bad 80s syrupy saxophone, which is a little bit much. But apart from that, I love the song Catch My Fall, but easily my favorite song off this record. As generic as it sounds, it was when I was in my obsessed with Billy Idol phase from like I said, 1994 to like 1998. It was my favorite song of all time, which is Eyes Without a Face. Still easily my favorite song off this record. Probably my favorite Billy Idol solo song. This one is number 2. I mean, this was another one that could easily be number 1. Billy Idol's out on tour right now. Actually, I think currently speaking, he is up in Canada. But over the past year and a half, he's been doing the celebration of the Rebel Yell 40th anniversary, and they reissued a deluxe edition, which actually had a bunch of really cool unreleased material. So if you are a big fan of the Rebel Yell album, which I am, that's something to look into. There are actually a couple of songs that were completely unreleased. And then there's a lot of like demo versions and early versions and working versions of some of the classics off of Rebel Yell, which to me is the jugs. I mean, to me, that's one of the best albums of the 80s. If you use the term 80s as a genre, to me, that's one of the best albums of the 80s. All right. We made it! Number 1. Again, this one could be 1, 2, or 3. 3 could be 1, 2, or 3. 2 could be 1, 2, or 3. These top 3 are so tight. But to me, it comes down to this being, I think, one of the greatest punk rock albums ever made. Still to this point. Still to this day, I should say, this is still one of the greatest punk rock albums ever made. It was released on March 17th, 1978. Produced by Martin Rushnet, and that is the 1978 Generation X self-titled debut. This is an album that I still go back and listen to, I mean, easily at least once or twice a month. And I first picked up this record in 1994, and I literally don't think that this record has left heavy rotation in my life since then. This is one of the greatest albums ever recorded, in my opinion. And if you are one of those people who is sort of a poo-pooer of Billy Idol, especially based on some of his, the lesser material of his solo career, go back and listen to this record, because this is as good as any other classic punk album out there. I mentioned it before. I did do a deep dive on this album back a few months ago on this channel, so if you're interested, I don't know why you would be, but if you are, go back and check it out. I mean, this album, I love it. The production on this album is perfect. It's clean, it's crisp, it's snappy, it's bratty, it's cocky, it's confident, it oozes with sexuality. Even back in 1977, 1978, Billy Idol was already one of the best frontmen in the game. He oozed confidence. He dripped sexuality. I mean, this record is as perfect a record as you're going to find if you are a fan of this style of music. I don't know what to tell you. I mean, you could go through every song on the track listing. Every single song is pretty much perfect. I mean, this is as perfect an album as I can imagine. I mean, Give Me Some Truth, Wild Youth, From the Heart, Promises, Promises. I mean, I'll say this, the only song off this album that is even halfway questionable to me are the last 2 songs on the album. One being Wild Dub, which is basically a dub version of Wild Youth, which Wild Youth is one of my favorite songs off this record. So Wild Dub, I could sort of take it or leave it in a way, but the very last song on this record, Youth, 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 which I love the first half of. The last half of the song, it sort of tails on a little bit too long, at least in my opinion. But apart from that, I mean, if you can find a flaw with this album, and you can convince me that it's actually a flaw, I will eat my hat, son. Anyway, for me, this is number 1. Not easy when it came down to this ranking, which was number 1. It could have just as easily been Valley of the Dolls, as far as that's concerned. But anyway, we made it, man. We made it. We ranked the albums of one of the most important artists in the history of my life, the human gateway drug, as I refer to him, Mr. Billy Idol. Now, as I talked about a little bit earlier before, Billy Idol's newest studio record, as of right now, is the album Kings and Queens of the Underground, which is 10 years old this year, which is hard to believe. It's hard to believe that this record's already 10 years old. I say the same thing all the time when it comes to Morrissey and the record World Peace Is None of Your Business. The fact that that record is 10 years old just blows me away. But apparently, Billy Idol does have a new record that is supposed to be coming out next year. It's something that I'm relatively excited about. It's something that I will hopefully review on this channel when the time comes. But I got to tell you that I am actually somewhat excited about it, because over the past couple of years, Billy Idol has put out a couple of EPs that I'm not going to lie to you, I think are pretty snug, and some of them have some of the best material that Billy Idol has put out since the 80s. The first one being this record, which came out, I think, a couple of years ago now. It's hard to believe some of this stuff ages so fast. This is the Roadside EP. I love this. It's only 4 songs, but the song Bitter Taste is, I think the song Bitter Taste is probably the best song that Billy Idol has done. Probably since Whiplash Smile. I'm not kidding. I love that song. Rita Hayworth is a good song. Baby Put Your Clothes Back On is a good song. There's one song on this one that I don't love. It's called You Don't Have to Kiss Me Like That. But the song Bitter Taste is actually, I think this is probably literally the best thing that he's put out since probably like 1986. He also put out recently, and I just have this one on CD, but he put out another 4-song EP recently called the Cage EP, which you should definitely check out as well if you're a fan and you haven't heard this. I like the song Cage. It's not as good as Bitter Taste, at least in my opinion, but Running from the Ghost is the best song on this EP. That song is the Jugs. Rebel Like You and Miss Nobody are also both good songs. I would actually say the title track Cage is probably the weakest song off of this one, but both of these records have come out over the past couple of years, and so, you know, I'm actually kind of looking forward to the new record based on the stuff he's been putting out recently, because this stuff is as snug as anything he's put out really since the 80s. I mean, it's better than Charm Life, it's better than Cyberpunk, it's better than Kings and Queens, it's better than Devil's Playground, so I'm kind of excited if he's sort of heading in this direction. I mean, the song Bitter Taste is funny because it's not at all a song that I would sort of associate with Billy Idol. It's a very dark, introspective song. It makes me think of a song about like sort of getting older and sort of being faced with your own mortality, which is something that you don't always associate. With Billy Idol, I don't associate Billy Idol with necessarily writing dark songs. I mean, he's like, Billy Idol, man, yeah, party guy, but the song Bitter Taste is the Jugs, in my opinion. Anyway, man, we made it. Made it to the end of another one of these ranking videos. This will probably be the last ranking video I do for a little while. It's the last one that I have in the hopper as of right now, but I will be working on some other stuff coming up. So this is, I want to say thank you so much for checking out this video. This is Archaic Records. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. Be sure to go out and support your local record store. Check back most weeks for Morrissey Monday, a weekly celebration of all things Morrissey and the Smiths, as well as other record content and album reviews throughout the week. And until next time, my friends, talk to you then.